Latoya had been dreaming of a peaceful escape for months. The relentless grind of city life, the constant noise of car horns, and the weight of raising 3 kids on her own had taken its toll. When Marcus, her husband, suggested a weekend getaway, it was the perfect solution. A quiet cabin in the mountains, far from the chaos of their everyday lives, was exactly what they needed. For once, there would be no work to worry about, no school runs, no bills. Just them. The whole family. Marcus had always been the more spontaneous one. While Latoya liked to plan every detail, he loved the idea of finding an adventure, of stepping into the unknown. And so, they packed up their kids, Amara, Jamal, and little Elijah, and set out on the long drive, excited about the freedom of the open road. The weather was perfect, with the sun shining down and the air crisp. The children were eagerly chatting in the back seat, asking questions about the cabin, excited to explore a place they had never been. But Latoya couldn't shake the nagging feeling in the back of her mind. It wasn't that she didn't want the getaway. It was just that the excitement of leaving their busy lives behind seemed almost too good to be true. She had heard of places like this, the kind of secluded hideaways that people sought to escape to, only to realize later that something darker was waiting for them. "Mom, I can't wait to see the cabin," Amara said, her voice filled with enthusiasm. "Is it far?" "Not too much farther," Latoya replied, trying to sound cheerful. "We'll be there soon." Jamal, who had been quiet until now, piped up from the back seat. "Do you think there'll be any animals? Like bears? Or wolves?" Latoya smiled, shaking her head. "I'm sure we'll see some wildlife, but no bears, I promise. We'll be safe." As the miles passed, however, the landscape began to change. The busy highways gave way to winding rural roads, lined with dense trees that stretched for miles. The trees grew thicker and the hills steeper, casting long shadows across the road. Latoya's unease grew with every turn. "Maybe we should have looked for somewhere more popular," Latoya murmured, half to herself. Marcus, sensing her apprehension, reached over and squeezed her hand. "You're overthinking it, babe. This is exactly what we need. A break. No distractions, no worries." Latoya nodded, trying to push her doubts away. She had to believe that this getaway would be the fresh start they needed. As they neared the final stretch of their journey, the trees grew even more dense, the road narrowing until it felt like they were driving through a tunnel of dark branches. The sunlight was quickly fading, and a strange sense of isolation hung in the air. Then, up ahead, they saw it, the turnoff to their cabin. The sign was old, its paint chipped and faded, but it marked the way. Latoya's heart skipped a beat, and she swallowed the lump in her throat. They had reached their destination. "I think this is it," she said, her voice almost a whisper. Marcus smiled, squeezing her hand tighter. "Let's see what this place has to offer." The cabin sat nestled in a clearing, surrounded by trees that seemed to have a life of their own. There was an old, rustic charm to it, but something about the way the trees loomed over it gave Latoya pause. It felt as though the forest itself was guarding the cabin, hiding its secrets. "Wow," Amara said, breaking the silence. "It's so quiet here." "Yes, it is," Latoya murmured, the weight of the silence settling over her. They got out of the car and unloaded their bags, trying to shake off the odd feeling in the pit of Latoya's stomach. They had come here for peace, after all. And yet, as the sun dipped below the horizon, it felt as though something else was waiting for them in the shadows of the trees. The night was falling faster than they had anticipated. By the time they finished unpacking the car, the sky was dark, and the air had grown colder. Latoya was eager to settle in, but a part of her kept glancing at the shadows stretching long across the forest. She tried to ignore it, focusing instead on the cabin and the warmth it offered. Inside, the cabin was rustic but cozy, with a large stone fireplace that promised comfort on cold nights. There were creaky wooden floors and mismatched furniture, but there was a certain charm to it. The scent of pine lingered in the air, and the crackling fire cast flickering shadows on the walls. "Mom, can I explore outside?" Amara asked, her voice bubbling with excitement. Latoya hesitated. It was already late, and the darkness of the forest seemed to swallow everything around them. But the kids had been so good on the drive, and she didn't want to ruin their excitement. "Okay, but stay close," she warned. "Don't go too far." Amara nodded eagerly and ran outside, her laughter fading into the night. Marcus followed her, saying he'd help her gather some firewood. Latoya stayed inside, tidying up the cabin and preparing dinner. But as she moved about, she felt a strange presence, something just beyond her sight. She glanced at the window, half expecting to see someone standing in the yard, watching them. But there was nothing, just the dark expanse of trees and the flicker of distant stars. Her unease grew. She couldn't explain it, but there was a sense that they were not alone here. It wasn't just the silence of the forest, it was something deeper. Later, as Marcus and the children returned, Latoya could see their faces were more serious than before. Amara's excitement had faded, replaced by a nervous tension in her posture. "What's wrong?" Latoya asked, noticing how tense Marcus seemed, his jaw clenched. "We didn't go too far," Marcus said, his voice tight. "But I think we should stay inside tonight. It's getting too cold out there." "I agree," Latoya said, relief flooding her. She hadn't realized how much the atmosphere had begun to unsettle her until now. They ate dinner in silence, the only sounds coming from the fire crackling in the hearth. But even with the warmth of the cabin around them, an eerie chill seemed to linger in the air. As the night wore on, they tried to relax. Marcus put on a movie to distract the children, but Latoya's mind kept wandering back to the darkness outside. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that they had made a mistake coming here. And then, just as they were beginning to settle, a strange sound broke the silence, a soft thumping, as if something was tapping against the side of the cabin. Latoya's heart skipped a beat. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Marcus stood up, his face hardening. "I'll check it out," he said, walking toward the door. But before he could reach the handle, there was another sound, a low, guttural growl from the darkness outside. It wasn't an animal. It was something else. Latoya's breath caught in her throat. "Marcus, don't go out there." But it was too late. The door swung open, and the cold air rushed in. The growl grew louder, closer. Marcus stepped outside, his figure disappearing into the night. Latoya rushed to the door, calling after him, but he was gone. The cold was overwhelming now, the air thick with something unnatural. The door slammed shut behind her, and she was left alone, with nothing but the eerie sounds of the forest closing in. The silence that followed Marcus's departure was deafening. Latoya stood frozen by the door, listening, her heart hammering in her chest. She tried to steady her breath, but the tension in the air made it feel impossible. What was that sound? It wasn't just the wind or an animal. It was something darker. She turned to the children, who were wide-eyed and clinging to each other in the corner of the room. Amara was trembling, her gaze fixed on the door. Jamal, usually so brave, was pale, and even little Elijah seemed unsettled. "Where's Daddy?" Amara whispered. Latoya forced a smile, though her stomach churned. "He's just checking something outside. He'll be right back." But even as she said the words, she knew they didn't ring true. Why would Marcus go out there alone after hearing that sound? He wasn't reckless. The minutes stretched on, dragging like hours. Latoya paced the cabin, her mind racing. She knew she couldn't stay here, not with whatever was out there. But at the same time, she couldn't leave Marcus, not without knowing what was going on. A sudden crash outside made her jump. The children screamed, and she rushed to the door, her hand trembling on the handle. "Mom!" Jamal cried. "What's happening?" I don't know, baby, Latoya said, her voice strained. She looked at the kids, her mind torn between running and staying. Stay here. I'll be right back. She opened the door just a crack, peering into the darkness. The growling was louder now, echoing from the trees. Her eyes darted around, trying to make sense of the shadows that seemed to shift unnaturally. Then, she saw him. Marcus was standing by the trees, his back turned to her, frozen in place. His posture was stiff, unnatural. It was as though he wasn't even aware of her presence. Marcus. Latoya called out, her voice high with panic. But he didn't respond. He didn't even move. Latoya's heart pounded in her chest as she stepped out of the cabin, every instinct screaming at her to turn back. But she couldn't leave him out there. She had to bring him back. She moved cautiously, her eyes flicking between the trees and the dark figure of her husband. The growling had stopped, but the air was thick with an eerie tension. Marcus, she called again, her voice shaking. Finally, he turned, his face pale, eyes wide with fear. For a moment, he looked like he had seen a ghost, his expression empty and distant. There's something out there, he whispered, his voice hoarse. It's not natural. We have to leave. We can't stay here. Latoya stepped closer, reaching out for him, her fear mounting. What do you mean? What's out there? But before he could answer, the growl returned, louder than ever. It came from behind them, deep in the forest, but this time, it wasn't just one. The growling was joined by a chorus of low, menacing sounds. It was as though the forest itself was alive, its very breath turning against them. Marcus grabbed Latoya's arm, pulling her toward the cabin. We need to go now, he said urgently. We're not alone here. As they reached the door, Latoya could feel the weight of something unseen pressing in on them. The air was growing colder, the shadows darker. She looked back one last time, but all she saw was the blackness of the trees, no movement, no shape. Just the still, suffocating silence. Inside the cabin, they locked the door. The children were huddled together, eyes wide with fear. Jamal had a flashlight in his hand, and Elijah was clutching his toy tightly, as if it could somehow protect him. We need to get out of here, Marcus said, his voice barely above a whisper. We can't stay. It's too dangerous. Latoya nodded, though her mind was spinning. She didn't know what was out there, or why it was so desperate to keep them there, but one thing was clear, they were no longer in control. The peaceful getaway they had hoped for was slipping further away with each passing second. The night dragged on in the cabin as the tension in the air grew unbearable. The forest outside felt alive, as though it were watching them. Latoya sat near the window, the blinds drawn, but her mind refused to quiet. The growls had stopped, but the silence was more unnerving. Every rustle of leaves, every creak of the old wood, seemed amplified in the stillness. What do we do now? Marcus asked, his voice strained. He was pacing near the fireplace, eyes darting between the dark windows and the flickering flames. I don't know, Latoya whispered. We can't stay here, but I don't know where we'd go. The cars parked out front. If we drive, we're still surrounded by the forest. We need to get back on the main road, Marcus said, his voice clipped. We're not safe here. We'll head back to the town, find help. It seemed like the best option, though every part of her screamed that they weren't going to just walk away from this unscathed. The forest outside was no longer just a backdrop, it felt like a trap. It was as though the trees themselves were moving, slowly closing in around them. We can't let the kids see how scared we are, Latoya said, her voice low but firm. We have to keep it together, for them. But inside, she wasn't so sure. The kids were silent in the corner, each lost in their own thoughts, the fear in their eyes impossible to ignore. It was Amara, the oldest, who finally spoke up. Mom, what's happening out there? What was that noise? Latoya turned to her daughter, trying to offer a reassuring smile. I don't know, sweetheart. But we're safe inside here. We're not alone, and we're going to get through this together. I promise. But even as she spoke the words, she wasn't sure she believed them. The air outside was thick with something unseen, and she could feel it pressing in on the cabin, clawing at the walls. We need to get moving, Marcus said, snapping her back to the present. The longer we stay here, the more dangerous it gets. Latoya stood, her mind racing. We'll leave first thing in the morning. It's too dark to drive safely now. Marcus nodded, but he didn't look convinced. We can't wait till morning. This place, it's wrong. It's like it's alive, trying to keep us here. The words hit her like a cold shock. She glanced at the door, then out the window. The shadows were deeper now, the forest thick with an unsettling quiet. The trees seemed to stretch unnaturally tall, their branches intertwining in a way that felt wrong. Where are we? Latoya whispered. Latoya's question lingered in the air, unanswered. There was no clear response, no simple explanation. She had thought that the deep woods would be peaceful, that a quiet getaway would be a break from the noise of their hectic lives. But this felt different. Jamal shifted nervously, his flashlight beam flickering in the growing darkness. Mom, I'm scared, he whispered, his voice barely audible. I know, baby, Latoya replied, her voice trembling but trying to keep the fear from reaching him. But we're going to stay strong. We'll figure this out, okay? Marcus was already heading toward the door, pulling on his jacket. We're going to have to leave tonight. No more waiting. His words were firm, but there was an edge of desperation in his tone. Latoya hesitated. You're right, but the car's not going anywhere tonight. It's parked at the end of a narrow road, and the forest's too thick to navigate easily, especially in the dark. We need to wait until morning. Marcus looked at her, his eyes wild with fear. You're not hearing me, Latoya. There's something in those woods. Something we don't understand. If we wait until morning, it might be too late. The intensity in his voice sent a chill through her. She wanted to argue, but deep down, a nagging feeling told her he was right. The forest wasn't just an obstacle. It was something that had drawn them in, something that wasn't going to let them leave without a fight. Latoya grabbed her coat, her fingers shaking as she buttoned it up. Okay, we'll go now. We'll find a way out. The children were still quiet, but she could feel their fear. They all sensed it, this creeping, suffocating terror that wasn't just a product of the darkness. It was something real. The moment they opened the door, the temperature seemed to drop even further. The wind howled through the trees, carrying with it a faint, eerie whisper. Marcus motioned for them to stay close. Keep together. We can't afford to get separated. They made their way out into the night, the woods pressing in on them from every side. The trees were towering, their bark twisted and gnarled, as if the forest itself had a life of its own. The path to the car seemed further than it had before, the shadows too thick, the darkness too oppressive. It felt as though the forest was closing in, pushing them toward something. Latoya glanced back at the cabin, its warm light now nothing more than a distant memory, swallowed up by the darkness of the hollow. The air felt heavy with unseen eyes watching them, waiting. What's that? Jamal whispered, his hand clutching her sleeve. He pointed ahead, where the shadows shifted unnaturally. At first, Latoya thought it was just another trick of the light, a figment of her overactive imagination. But then, the trees in front of them seemed to move. A figure, dark and indistinct, stepped out from between the trunks. Latoya's breath caught in her throat. The figure was too tall, its limbs too long. It didn't look like a person. Stay close, Marcus warned, grabbing Latoya's arm. They kept walking, but the figure didn't move. Instead, it seemed to watch them from the shadows, as though it were waiting for them to come closer. The whispering wind carried the unmistakable sound of growling, low and guttural, reverberating through the trees. Latoya's stomach dropped as she realized the growls were no longer just distant. They were here, surrounding them. The forest seemed to grow darker with each step. The trees were closing in, their branches reaching toward them like clawed hands. The path they had once followed so confidently now seemed like an impossible maze, twisting and turning in ways that defied logic. "Mom, I don't like this," Amara said, her voice shaking. "We're almost there," Latoya said, trying to reassure her daughter. But the lie was hollow, even to her own ears. Then the growls grew louder. The sound seemed to echo all around them, vibrating through the ground beneath their feet. The darkness around them seemed to thicken, pressing in from all sides. Latoya's heart raced as she realized that the forest wasn't just a backdrop to their journey, it was actively trapping them. There was no escape. Not from the forest, not from whatever watched them from the shadows. "We need to run," Marcus said suddenly, his voice frantic. "Now." Before Latoya could react, Marcus grabbed her hand and pulled her toward the car. They sprinted through the thick underbrush, branches scraping against their clothes, the ground uneven beneath their feet. Behind them, the growls grew louder, and the figure, whatever it was, followed, moving faster than any human could. Latoya's breath came in ragged gasps. The trees around them were no longer just trees. They were closing in, their limbs twisting as if alive, making the path ahead seem impossible to navigate. The car, so close, was suddenly out of reach, swallowed up by the growing darkness. "We won't make it," Latoya thought, her chest tightening in terror. But then, Marcus shouted. "There! The road! We just need to reach the road." They pushed forward, the dark figure still trailing them, its growls growing louder, angrier. Latoya's legs burned with exhaustion, her mind screaming for them to escape, to leave this cursed place. But the path seemed endless, and the forest seemed to stretch on forever. Finally, through the dense trees, the faint glow of headlights broke through the darkness. They had reached the road.